Tyler Zombro, also known as Z, also known as head of the data team here at Tread. First off, it's Valentine's Day, so as a show of my appreciation, I just wanted to give you a Seam Shift sinker ball.
Thank
I
you.
know this is very valuable gift for you.
I wish I had a cobalt ball to give you for your femur.
Well,
but
I already have that, so we're good to go.
Here we are.
But yeah, I thought it'd be interesting to have a sit down before you head off to spring training. Obviously, you're still in your own playing career, and our followers somewhat have an idea now of like who you are as it relates to Tread, as it relates to like you have a lot of data knowledge, but maybe they don't understand kind of your story, your playing career side of things. So yeah. I thought it'd be cool to kind of sit down. Hey, let's just kind of break down your own playing career and some of like the crazy stuff that's happened over the past few years for you.
Yeah.
And then, as we get through that, we can kind of just talk about some general advice from the data side that people can take away from this, whether it's coaches, whether it's athletes. So I guess my first question is, could you kind of take us through like your college career, your playing career, how you got recruited out of high school? Obviously, you've never been like a super hard throwing guy. You've never been like the guy who just was always a top prospect, but take us through kind of the college side of things to how you actually found your way into pro baseball first.
Yeah, so I'm from a small town in Virginia, not heavily recruited. It was about finding a unique fit. I was like a 84 to 87 mile an hour, lower-ish slot, crafty righty. So as soon as you hear crafty righty, you're
never a good sign when you hear crafty or matchup.
Yeah. But baseball had been in my family. I had really good knowledge about the game. Felt like I knew how to pitch at that point, right? Like sequencing, expanding off, moving the ball around the strike zone, was really good with that. So thankfully in high school, another area coach was friends with a guy, George Mason. It was as simple as I went up to a prospect camp at George Mason, threw in front of the entire coaching staff, received a scholarship offer there on the spot, continued to play summer ball that year, junior summer, but ended up committing to George Mason the following winter. So ironically, with all of the showcase stuff and playing for a prominent national showcase team with the Stars, I ended up just getting my best offer and where I decided to go through going to an individual camp.
Which is actually it's a very uncommon thing, I feel like, for people to actually get recruited out of those camps. I know they're kind of marketed as recruiting/development camps, but like you and I both know how rare it is. Like those are like the fundraiser, the money-making thing for kind of the assistant coaching staff. It's not really, even though they might market it as it's not really getting a ton of instruction, and they're not usually just like writing scholarship offers to those kids. So it's, you and I both have a similar story. And from that standpoint, like I went to a tryout in Maryland and just was offered right there. You went to the same tryout, George Mason, were offered right there. But like that's very much in the minority.
Right. It was really unique because I had the personal relationship through another coach to that. And so it felt very much like a one-on-one session with the entire coaching staff. And for how I pitched, it was like, oh, this is great. I can move the ball in and out, sequence things. And obviously that impressed them to the point of offering me. But went through that. Really my only competitive offers were a few Ivy Leagues, William & Mary and George Mason. Decided to go to George Mason based upon some credits transferring from high school.
Gotcha.
Took a little bit of the easier road academically. Thoroughly enjoyed my experience there, but go in as a freshman, wasn't sure how much I was going to actually pitch. Turns out college coaches really love strike throwers, so I found myself throwing a ton early on. Served as a closer my first year there with a few spot starts in between. And then sophomore, junior, senior year, I started every Friday night, or Friday day. Don't have lights at the field, so it's all day games
100%.
there. But really thankful that I was able to throw so much in college. Ended up throwing over 300 innings. Certainly a lot of toll on me physically looking back, but, really crafted me into who I am as a pitcher, gave me a lot of exposure, a lot of in-game scenarios, things to weigh through. But that really started to shape my identity as a pitcher. Is just when you're starting every Friday night, you learn what you need to do to be successful.
So at that point, did you think you had a shot at getting drafted, or how did you ultimately make it into pro ball? Were you being told like, hey, you're going to go in X round, or did you kind of know like, hey, I don't have that elite level stuff, but I know how to pitch, I know how to get batters out.
Right.
What was that kind of conversation at that point?
I think actually I was really blindsided by all of it. You went to Maryland, which you're familiar-ish with George Mason, like early 2000s, a lot of really good teams, late 2000s. And then thankfully, my freshman year, we were pretty good too. But mid-majors kind of run in spurts, right? But, I looked up I think I had like a 1.9 ERA as a freshman. I had like a 4 as a sophomore, a 3 something as a junior, a 2 something as a senior across a lot of innings. And I'm sitting there thinking I had been like 87 to 90 ish. And I'm like, oh, I'm throwing up great numbers in Division I baseball. There's no shot I don't get drafted.
Right.
I go up to the Cape my sophomore year. I'm there on a temporary contract. I get released. Junior year comes. I'm really trying to throw hard, obviously, to impress, to get my name called. Got up to 93 that year, but go through, thought I actually had a good shot with a certain team and a deal in place, but that fell through as well. So then it's like, okay, well, I get to my senior year and all these things I thought to be true, like you're being told your whole life, like don't worry too much about velocity, like put your head down, just keep pitching.
Just get outs, just throw strikes.
Exactly.
All that stuff.
And I'm not saying that that's not my mindset on the field, is to obviously compete to the best of my ability. But, that's ultimately what got me into the training sector was I'm like, all right, well, I have been pitching very, very well. The performance is clearly there, but it didn't lead to me a chance in professional baseball.
Right.
So obviously I come to a crossroads there.
So at what point did you pivot there? Was that after the junior year when you were up to 92, 93, and that still wasn't good enough to get drafted despite putting up numbers? Was that the pivot point where you said, I need to figure out some other difference maker?
Yes, 100%. So it's actually, if you go back through my junior year numbers, it's kind of crazy. So I wanted to light up the radar gun. I knew that was the last touch I needed to be selected in the draft because the performance was there. I get up to 93, there's still not traction. That back half of my junior year, I was lights out. And a lot of that was me soul searching on an identity where I'm like, why am I throwing so many 4 seams trying to flash 93? Like, let me go pitch with my sinker at 90 or 88 to 90, whatever it was at the time. And there was like a stretch there. I'll never forget, like, I think I went George Washington, Radford, combined 18 innings, like 3 hits, something crazy. But it was like, okay, I need to go back to the identity of who I am as a pitcher and be successful with that. Because obviously me changing my profile for 2 to 3 miles an hour is hurting my performance. And that's the last thing I wanted. So within that, even I went to my senior year, it took a lot of humility. I'm like, well, shit, I throw pretty slow. So I need to figure this out. Do I want to throw harder? Absolutely. But then it was like, from a data standpoint, how can I be successful? How can this translate to the next level? And for me, that became where the sinker slider profile just started to really run.
Do you feel like at that point, teams were kind of still in this mindset of like, they didn't really understand kind of the outlier nature of, different pitch metrics. They didn't necessarily understand the TrackMan data. Like TrackMan was just coming out at that point and starting to be used more readily. Do you think they really just didn't recognize how important having like a ton of sink on a sinker was, or like throwing from a really weird slot or being really funky like you are? Do you think they just didn't fully appreciate that side of it, and now teams are getting better at actually identifying that and scouting for that specifically?
I think it was a lot of not understanding data behind it, but also kind of like a fear on the player development side of like, well, how much more can we add to this guy? Like, can he throw 2 to 3 miles an hour harder? Can he have a put away breaking ball? Which at that point I hadn't done a ton of stuff slider design wise to get more sweep, but as we're looking at it, say, okay, he's 87 to 90, throws a ton of strikes, walks less than 2% of batters, but what's the upside? And I think that's a lot of what amateur scouting is looking at upside, which I think upside is never an adjective to describe myself.
Right.
But I just think that like model of consistency, again, the data being consistent, how it profiled for ground balls, etc., that probably wasn't appreciated, but I also know on that amateur side, they are looking for the upside perspective of a guy getting to the big leagues.
So how did you ultimately get signed? Obviously you weren't drafted, but what was it that you think kind of put you over the hump to ultimately make it into the Rays organization, getting signed? Did you impress at a tryout? Did you have to pop a 92 in front of a scout just to get that opportunity? Did they just come in, talk to you, recognize that there was a spark there? Like, what happened?
Yeah, so it's funny because the offer actually seems kind of backhanded when I recap it. But so I graduated. I was pre-med, pre-PT. I had actually debated at the time of going to med school or PT school and just kind of moving on. I was not going to play independent ball. I decided to start working full-time at R&D where I was in DC. I'd actually been there a full month. So a full month had gone by post-draft. Obviously nothing happened. I'm salty. I'm bitter. I'm like, how the heck does this happen?
Right,
Like
right.
I'm way better than these guys. I know that. The numbers literally say that. But why am I not getting a shot? It was pretty spiteful, honestly. Go through an entire month of working full time. Hadn't really been throwing. It was like a Friday morning at work. It's like July 1st, I believe. I get a phone call. I actually missed it because I was working, from the Rays area scout, Lou Wieben. And so I immediately run outside, call him back. And he's like, "Hey man, this offer isn't sexy by any stretch of the imagination, but would you sign a contract to go pitch in the GCL? Because we need some guys to fill innings," which literally word for word, like inning
Right,
filler,
right.
you know. So that's already like, or like, oh, I want to be an inning filler. But at that point, I'm like, you know, like, of course, it's my dream to play professional baseball. I want to go do it, see how long it rides out. There's certainly been some bumps in the road and, you know, some hardships kind of from that, and going to extended the next year, obviously the injury stuff, but a lot of good runs in between there. But it all started off of, hey, can you go fill a couple of innings? So really reflecting on that, I think I got the offer because they knew I was going to go throw however many innings they needed, and I was
Right.
going to throw strikes.
100%. How do you think that shaped you then, like coming in from that kind of underdog mindset or mentality where you were never the highly touted prospect? You never like came in having to, live up to some sort of expectation. You went in like as this guy who thought his career was over, and you were suddenly given this shot. Like how did that kind of shape your mentality going into pro ball?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't felt any pressure in professional baseball. And I know we've done many of these podcasts and everybody says it. It's like when you let go of that pressure, that's when you're finally really, really good. I know even my first couple outings when I was in Princeton and rookie ball, I'm so stressed out because I'm like, golly, if I pitch bad, like I'm out of here. Like I've got no shot. I got $700 to sign. Clearly I am not a priority. I'm
Right.
literally the last priority.
Right.
And so it's like anytime I threw poorly, I'm freaking out about it. But also, in pro ball, there's a lot of environmental factors that you can really soak in to realize, especially looking at your Latin American teammates who are coming from nothing, just kind of the perspective they have on life in general. And I'm like, why am I putting this pressure on myself? I don't need to do that. Like I just need to go have fun. I'm not supposed to be a big leaguer anyways. And so then once I started embracing that and being a little more relaxed, I certainly started to perform much better.
Do you feel like once you get your foot in the door, once you actually just convince one person to give you that one shot, now it actually truly does become about on-field results, getting hitters out? Or do you still feel like there was kind of that like stigma against a slowish throwing, funky righty just from day? Like, did you always have to fight that to make it up through AAA where you've been past couple of years, or did it suddenly become about on-field results? Like if I put up numbers, I'm going to be able to move up through this organization.
I think it's definitely a balance of those things. It obviously sways way harder towards the stuff. There are tons of guys who get promoted without any flashing performance numbers, but the stuff says they will perform at some point in time. And I know that despite me being on the opposite end of that spectrum. Right. But that's the reality of it. It's, for myself, I view it as almost like a 80-20 scale of like 80% performance, 20% projectability, because that's just how I'm profiled as a pitcher. But you see that as you continue to move up, it's like you've got to keep putting up numbers from my standpoint, because the outlying projectability is just not there. And whether that's fair, unfair, whatever it might be, that's just kind of how it works with a lot of organizations.
Just the reality of the situation.
It is. I remember Dewey Robinson, who I loved as a pitching coordinator in Tampa, and then all of our Pirates guys here. I talked to him a ton about Dewey. Dewey was our coordinator, and I'll never forget, in 2018, I went to extended spring training. And to this day, I say the 2018 spring training is the best I've ever thrown the ball. I mean, I don't know how many innings I threw that spring, but carving, threw more sliders, started striking more people out. Velo was good relative to how I throw. And I got sent to extended. And I'm seeing all these other, prospects who didn't pitch well in spring training going to Bowling Green to start the year. And so I'm bitter. I'm with a bunch of 16, 17-year-olds facing Wander Franco on a backfield at 8 a.m. I'm like, what am I doing? I'm 23. Had a few conversations like with Chuck Ritchie, who's now the scouting director in Tampa. He's like, just keep grinding it out, man. Like reports are positive. It's just kind of how the system is. And Dewey pulled me aside, like second day of extended. He's like, hey, I know you've obviously got a rich playing history. The unfortunate realities of our system and how we operate is we've got to go give these guys a chance. And that just is what it is. And honestly, I appreciated that conversation more than he'll ever know, because as a player, you're sitting there, you're going to do everything in your control to make it. But at a certain time, you can't be negligent to the fact that the system works a certain way.
Right.
Guys who received $1 million in the draft have to go get an opportunity to fail. I don't have to go get that opportunity.
Right.
For me, they're waiting on me to fail in that scenario. And when he had that conversation, he's like, we have no reservations about sending you to A-ball, high A, double A, wherever. We think you can go compete at any level, but you're just simply not a priority for varying factors. And you got to really respect that transparency from a coordinator specifically, so you know where you stand. But that's when I certainly did realize, like, the projectability upside, the financial investment that a team has in you, it's real. Whether people want to say it's not real or not, that's just the facts. And then, of course, from my end, not having that, you just got to perform and keep grinding your way up.
Right. I would definitely say, from my perspective, you'd rather have the honesty from the team. Is like, this is where we see you fitting. Or even like in college, like you'd rather know, like, this is where you are on the depth chart. Like, you are my number 7 reliever. Like, you'd rather know that than just have them blowing smoke up your ass, telling you like, oh, you just got to keep performing. You just gotta just control your control. It's like, just tell me the truth. Lay it all out there. If I need to throw 5 miles an hour harder, if I need to throw 10% more strikes, if I need to throw X% more first pitch strikes, or add 5 inches of swoop to my breaking ball, like, just give me a clear picture of what I need to do. If I'm a non-prospect, just straight up tell me what I would need to do to become a prospect. So the fact that you were given that transparency is very different from my experience and what a lot of, the guys that we've coached, what their experience is. So you have to respect that. But just to kind of relate to my story, like, as I was kind of working my way up through the ranks for the short time I was in professional baseball, like, I felt like I was one of the only guys who wasn't overly concerned about all the politics and all the moves that were happening.
Right.
Like, all the guys talk about constantly is, did you hear about this guy? He's getting moved up to double A. He had a 7 ERA, but he throws 98. Or what about this guy? Like, why are they playing favorites here? And like, this isn't fair. This guy signed for this much money. And like, it's all this complaining and talking about the politics and the moves. And it's like, that is all just noise. Like, you have to be able to put your blinders on and say, what do I need to do today to maximize my chance of success?
100%.
I need to focus on my recovery. I need to focus on my sleep. I need to focus on getting my dry work in. Whatever it is, like, getting my body as fresh as possible. Like, focus on what you can control, put your blinders on, and that's going to maximize your chance of success. But when you're just like obsessing about all the other kind of ancillary variables, like, all it can do is distract you from what you need to accomplish.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really, for me, over the last couple of years, like, that's been a huge thing. And I know it's been hard for myself. And like you said, not playing the politics game, when I did reframe my mindset of, like, I always say it, I'm playing with house money. I've got nothing to lose. I'm going to go out there, pitch to the best of my ability, and it's going to be good at that. But you look at, like, the political thing, like you're mentioning, is there are so many days where I could sit back and feel sorry for myself. 2019, I go to double A. It's kind of a sink or swim. This threw me in there to kind of fill at the beginning. Turns out I start the year really hot. I ended that year between double A and triple A being reliever of the year in 2019. And this goes back to the projectability stuff piece. I go from reliever of the year between double A and triple A in 2019 to I don't even see the alternate site in 2020. Like, how does that work?
Right.
You tell me I'm not a top 60, 70 player in the organization at that point. That just doesn't add up, right? And then, of course, you look at, in 2019, I went up and down to triple A 5 or 6 times. I'm throwing 3 innings in an extra inning game in double A, 1 day off, covering 2 2/3 in triple A when a guy doesn't get out of the first inning on a rehab assignment. I throw 2 innings in Toledo one night. I flew, this is one of my favorite stories, I flew Montgomery, Alabama to Atlanta. So I got a phone call at like 11 o'clock Central Time after the game in double A. Hey, you're going to meet Durham and Toledo. Fly from Montgomery to Atlanta, Atlanta to Detroit, land in Detroit at like 2:30, game starts at 5, have to Uber from Detroit to Toledo, literally get out of my Uber, don't even throw before the game, roll out, got to pitch 2 innings that night.
Oof.
Get hot the next day because somebody's throwing on the second half of back-to-back. Did the same thing actually in Charlotte one time. So like, there are all these pieces that you're just like, as a guy who's a free agent signed, don't have money to your name, like you're getting screwed.
Yeah.
Like it's either do you feel super sorry for yourself or you just kind of like buckle down, embrace it, and really try to fight against it.
People don't realize that. I mean, again, it is what it is, and like you have to approach it with the mentality that we're talking about. But the top prospects, like they're a baby, their arms are taken care of. If they hit their pitch count, whether they're pitching well, whether they're pitching poorly, like they're pulled. And then who goes in? Who mops up all the messes? It's the guys that they don't care if they blow their arm out. They don't care. They have no money invested in them. It's the guy that's going to potentially get released anyway in a month if he doesn't pitch well. So those are the guys that come in and they eat up the innings. And so at every step and turn, it's definitely more of an uphill battle to be the free agent, to be the guy that signed in the 36th round or the guy who was given $1,000 signing bonus. But that's not an excuse to dwell on that fact.
Right.
It's just the reality of the situation.
And I think it also works inverted the other way. Like sometimes the top prospects and the guys who do have the backing, they're not told the truth enough. Like it's like, oh, you're doing fine, keep doing what you're doing. Where in reality, like sometimes there's a tough conversation that needs to be had, and I think that's the mix you see in pro ball a ton, and that's something that's really cool about our jobs here. Is it doesn't matter if it's Clay Holmes or if it's the guy who was a senior sign on the absolute last leg of his professional career, or the 35-year-old in indie ball. It's like we're approaching your career and where you need to be developmentally in full transparency. I know I just had an athlete, and I don't want to name names, but 6-7 year big leaguer, velocity's down, but has good carry, has performed well throughout time. And like we have a very transparent conversation on how he needs to get his velo back to where it was, or he's not going to pitch in the big leagues again.
Right.
And he appreciated having that conversation more than anything because, teams will tell him, oh, well, your carry's still 22, like you can still get people out. But those guys need to hear the truth too.
Right. But we also, I would say, at Tread in particular, we believe in our ability to actually train some of those variables. So it's not like, okay, you need to add 3 miles an hour to your velo. Like, you suck, you're screwed. It's like, you need to add 3 miles an hour to your velo to pitch again. Here's the plan that is going to give us the best chance to do that. Whereas, like, I feel like at least, when I was in pro ball, it was almost like nobody wanted to just tell you, like, you don't throw hard enough or you, like, XYZ. They just danced around it. Meanwhile, you watch all the hard-throwing guys work their way up through the organization with poor stats at half the time, and they just dance around it because they don't want to just tell you, like, you throw 91, 92, that's why you're not moving up. Because they don't know how to train it, so, like,
right.
Why would they just tell you something that you can't change? Whereas we'll tell you that, but here's the plan to change that.
Same thing on the data side. Like, if a guy has a pitch that's bad, you just have an open conversation about it and tell him why it's bad and reframe what he should probably do more of. I know in 19 for me, my strikeout numbers went way up because pitching analyst Winston Doom, who's very transparent in Tampa, and I really appreciate him for this, approached me and he's like, hey, I know you've really pitched dominant with your sinker. That's been your profile your whole career, early counts, ground balls, blah, blah, blah. But when you get the 2 strikes, like, no more sinkers. Like, let's get rid of that. In the second half of 2019, I threw like 98% off speed with 2 strikes. And it made me a way better pitcher.
Right.
But like I wanted to hear that from somebody like, hey, I'm not saying your sinker's bad, but you should really stop throwing it with 2 strikes.
Right.
And having that conversation earlier in a career is certainly more valuable.
Well, what makes it constructive feedback versus just like, crapping on you is the fact that you actually give them something to do to fix it.
Right.
If your off speed sucks, it's not just like, hey, your off speed sucks, you're not going anywhere. It's like, here's an actual step-by-step plan to fix it, to add more horizontal to a slider or to add velo to your curveball or whatever it may be. So I think that's the distinction that you want to ultimately get to. But let's kind of step forward then to the head injury, which a lot of people have probably seen some of those highlights. I know ESPN did a story on it. Take us through that season, kind of like how you've been pitching up to that season and that game specifically. And then I'll kind of give my take on that situation, kind of watching it from afar, like from Tread while you're in season pitching. Yeah. But take us through like up to that point in the season, and then that game specifically.
Yeah, again going back to like 2019 to 2020, no alternate site. I'm ready to get back out on the field. I felt like I'm very close to the big leagues at this point in time. Go to Major League camp in 2021, actually get sent out of there pretty quick. At that point, they were still doing the alternate site. I didn't even stay in that. I went to regular minor league camp. It actually went down to like the last day before AAA broke that they told me I was going to AAA. So I'm excited about that. Obviously, my velocity had actually been ticking up. I know like the night before I was hurt, or 2 nights before, it's like 90-92 that outing, which is great for me. But really, it was a grind to even show that I needed to be in AAA, to show that, again, I felt good. Performance-wise, felt great to be back in a routine. Felt like I was hitting my like mid-season stride, you would say. You kind of get into the rhythm. So yeah, that night, I'll never forget, because I threw an inning in 2/3 and had 1 day off. Very low probability that I would be pitching that night. We actually had a couple guys supposed to piggyback as well. Massive rain delay in Durham that night. It's like super late start. I only remember that because I took my laptop to the field because I was like, oh, I want to like sit and look at some programs or something. But yeah, honestly, from that night, all I can really remember is the game is like going terribly, like it's very slow paced. Things were kind of getting weird with the pitching scenario. I remember my pitching coach, Rick Knapp, approached me in like the 4th or 5th when I was going into the clubhouse to roll out. It's like, hey, like we might need you tonight. And really that's all I remember from there, specifically leading up to that day.
100%. So from our perspective at Tread, obviously at that point we're in the other building, and all we start seeing is like, on Twitter people are talking about like Rays minor leaguer Tyler Zombro has been hit in the head by a baseball, and we're just like, what is going on? Like, is he okay? I can't even remember if I like watched the clip. Like, I don't even know, because the clip went around for like an hour, and then people stopped reposting it because
right.
Obviously you get hit by the comebacker, you're down on the ground, your body goes into kind of start twitching. They have to take you off the field, and then what's crazy is, I'm assuming that they rushed you to the hospital right away, but so you were in Durham for this, correct?
Yep.
And that's like one of the headquarters in the world. That's one of the places where the basically top like brain surgeons are, the top neurosurgeons are. So you were like what, 10 minutes from the top neurosurgeons in the world?
If that, like 5 minutes. I mean, Durham Stadium is a couple minutes from the hospital. So obviously you know more about what happened, and even though like you were out, we obviously we're getting like very secondhand reports and updates like hours after the fact. But from that point, that they had to go in, perform brain surgery within a couple hours of, or even sooner after. Yeah, I don't even know the timeline. So my recollection doesn't start until about 4 days after the event. So like even the slightest memory I have at all is being transferred ICU to a regular bed. So I was completely out of it. Like I have no recollection whatsoever.
Gotcha.
The brain is a magnificent tool for actually doing that. But from my understanding, and my athletic trainers are great in Durham. One of them specifically, Chris Russell, I've been with him for years, since rookie ball. We've literally been together level by level. My understanding is actually there was another injury in the same organization of a guy who had a leg injury, like a broken tibia or a femur. And the time it took them to even get him to the hospital from Montgomery Stadium, I had already been from the stadium to Duke Hospital in brain surgery. So it was like within an hour, my understanding is I was in surgery.
And so the main role there was to try to reduce all the pressure build up from the swelling in your brain itself, right? Because there was, I mean, we can put the CT scan up on the video right here, but it was a pretty substantial.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a hairline fracture. Like you had a skull fracture, you had swelling in your brain, and they need to go in and release the pressure as soon as possible.
Yeah. So it was, the people are always freaked out when I say like 48 titanium objects in my head, which is odd to say, but titanium, cobalt, same difference.
Same thing.
But the scarier part from, again, the neurological standpoint is with how the fracture kind of evolved, some piece of that somehow clips an artery somewhere, and so I had an epidural hematoma. So basically I have clotting there pushing against the brain, which obviously that swelling and inflammation is kind of the scariest part, especially if that gets inside of the brain, then you're really in trouble. So thankfully they rushed me there. the big thing is draining the hematoma to get the blood, the clotting, the swelling off of the brain, and then obviously repair the fracture. And then, from the video itself, like I've never watched it, and I hope nobody watches it because I know it got like blown up, and I had so many messages of people on Twitter, Instagram saying stuff about it. But like the truth of it is, like the seizure on the mound happens because I'm in a state of trauma, which again, the brain does crazy things to make you forget situations. Again, I have no recollection for 4 to 5 days. So it makes it look a lot worse than what it was, but in truthful nature, the reality is the big thing is them getting the inflammation, swelling, and that epidural hematoma out of there ASAP, so there's not permanent brain damage, which, thank God I was able to avoid.
So at what point, once you were awake and you kind of aware of what had happened, I guess what was the initial reaction when you woke up? Was it like, I just hope I can regain function? Was it like, did you know that like your brain was going to be okay? At that point, did the doctors really know how the recovery was going to go? Like, when did you kind of hit that turning point where it's like, okay, I'm physically, I'm going to get this back. I'm going to be okay. I don't know if I'm going to pitch again. Like, just take me through the thought process when you first came to.
So again, it was 4 days later or whatever. But I remember waking up. My family was there, so like, I remember my first thoughts are like, I looked at my wife, I looked at my mom, my dad, and I'm like, okay, well, I know who they all are, so like that's good. And then I'm like, what the hell happened? Because I don't remember anything.
Right.
So I'm like, and at this point, I'm also kind of mute because from where the swelling and inflammation was, where it pushed in, that would be my speech and motor cortex. So my speech cortex had inflammation around it, so my speech was pretty bad at first. But again, I was processing things. So I like basically somehow like mumble out some words of like what happened. And my wife then told me, you got hit in the head, been here for however many days, I'm starting to learn more about the situation. My neurologist, Dr. Cook, comes in, kind of gives me a rundown of what happened. And I'm like, okay, like I think this is fine, because I also knew that like Aroldis Chapman had been hit in the head, Danny Farquhar, Daniel Ponce de Leon, but like I know that those guys also just had like one plate put in for like a whatever fracture and were kind of fine. So I was hoping that it was like a small fracture line.
Chapman was back in, I think, 6 to 12 weeks, right? He was back pretty fast.
Yeah,
same season.
I knew it could happen fast, so I'm hoping, like it's a small fracture, whatever. I'll be fine. I'll be back in no time. And Dr. Cook's like, well, like it's gonna be a little bit longer than that. Here's kind of the extent to what things happened and what transpired. And so then when I found out the detailed information, I'm like, oh shit. Well, like this is way more important than baseball at this point. Like, I need to make sure all these other functionalities are operating correctly and get back to where I am from the mental state. And then I'll worry about the physical stuff later on. So my mindset definitely kind of framed. I knew when I did have that, conscious thought and could really break things down, analyze. Again, I was processing information fine.
You knew you didn't have permanent brain damage, but it was still, will I regain full like motor function in my body at that point?
Right, for sure. Yeah, that was, and like especially with speech therapy, getting through speech, obviously getting that back, I knew my reaction times would obviously be slow with that much inflammation around the brain. I didn't have feeling of the left side of my body for about 7 to 10 days, so no real function there. But then, thankfully, once the inflammation started to get out of there from post-op, the ball started rolling pretty quickly to regain full function.
So did they ever give you an indication they thought you might be able to pitch again? Or was that just like, they straight up tell you like, we don't think you're ever going to pitch again? Or did they say, let's just go one step at a time and see what happens? Or were you very adamant from the start, like, I'm going to pitch again? Like, how did that factor in?
Yeah. Honestly, right away, I was like, I don't care. I don't care if I pitch again or not. Like that's really not important to me right now. I think my brain is way better than my body anyways.
Right.
You would argue that my brain actually got my body to where it was pitching wise, and it's a brain first approach. But originally it was like, I don't care about being back on the mound. Let's take this one step at a time. I remember as I got through speech therapy, OT was getting a little more I guess, physical and PT at that point in time to regain strength, function, reaction. Then I was like, all right, well, I think I can do this again, and I want to do it again because I don't want that to be my last memory on a mound. So had a conversation with the neurologist, who's like, yeah, like I think we can get you back there. We're gonna have to do a repeat CT scan, make sure everything looks okay. You're also going to need to wear something because we have to have some layer of protection there. And so then that's when the conversation started rolling about, okay, how do we actually get back on the field?
Take me through kind of the psychology of that, because people that haven't necessarily competed at sports at a high level maybe don't understand, like, oh my God, you have this life-threatening injury. Why would you ever want to put yourself back in that situation? Or like the DeMar Hamlin thing that just happened. Someone was talking to me about, like, well, do you think he's going to play again? I'm like, I would want to play again if I was in that situation, but I'm probably in the minority. You're probably in the minority of people that haven't spent their entire life pursuing sports at that level. It probably doesn't make sense to them why somebody would want to go put themselves back in the same situation.
Right.
Could you kind of talk through that psychology of like, why would you ever want to go back on the mound knowing that could potentially happen again?
Yeah, I think so. First and foremost, it was definitely a long conversation between me and the people that I love the most. So, like, especially my wife, Mariah, I was like, again, I had made a great run out of it already. Again, 2019 through 2021 to that point, despite me being minor league reliever of the year, was not a smooth road at all. In fact, very frustrating. So it's like, okay, we're looking at this from like a life analysis of where we are too. And I'm like, hey, if you really don't want me to do it, like, I don't have to do it. I don't have to do this to meet my life requirements.
Right.
Like, it's not like I'm going to view myself as a failure if I don't pitch in the big leagues. Which then she gave me the response of, and we've been together since we were sophomores in high school. And she's like, no, like, I've seen how much you've worked for this, whether that's mental, physical, emotional, etc. She's seen how many hours I've put in through high school, college, professional. She's seen me working, training. She's seen it all. She's like, no, like, if you're cleared, like, you should do it if that's what you want to do. So again, like, the odds of that event happening obviously are 1 in a billion. And of course, I'm going to take every precaution necessary to make sure I'm safe. But once I knew from the neurologist, like, hey, I approve you playing and think you're safe if your CT scan looks good and you wear the protective headgear, then I was like, all right, well, if I have the support of my wife, then no doubt I'm going back and gonna make a run at it.
Awesome. I guess that takes it to the next phase of this story, which is, obviously still being written. But so you come back from the head injury, you're getting back into throwing, you're getting back into shape, and then obviously now you've had, like, TOS, thoracic outlet stuff starts to creep in. Take us through that process. So at what point in the return to throwing process, it's been, 6 months, 12 months at this point out of the initial head injury? At what point does that start to bug you? And just take us through the connection there, because we talked about the connection between the head injury and then potentially the TOS type stuff.
Yeah. So I wasn't really cleared for anything that increased head pressure for a while. So we're looking at, June until October. Like, I'm just trying to make sure, like, I'm good, right? I can't do anything where I'm lifting heavy. I can't really hold my breath. Nothing to increase intracranial pressure. So that, of course, kind of puts me behind the 8 ball from a strength side, which we know you don't lose strength very quickly, but, like, losing any form of stimulus is obviously bad.
Right.
And of course, the 3 to 4 weeks immediately post-op, I'm doing next to nothing. So started throwing. Like, throwing actually felt fine. Started getting in the weight room a bit more. I'm doing some more things. As I'm throwing, it wasn't bad at first, and then I go down to Florida. Typically in my pens, I'm like mid-ish 80s. I'm like, okay, my first live, I'm mid 80s. They had me, like, throw a pen off of that. I'm low 80s. I get back in a game, mid 80s. I started having some nerve stuff in my hand specifically. So I would wake up, my right hand would be discolored from my left. Started having nerve pain throughout, a ton of achiness in my thumb, almost like a carpal tunnel sensation. Keep going on. I'm like, all right, well, screw it. Like, I'm close to pitching in a game again. I'm not pulling the chute on this. And actually, unfortunately, I had pitched well enough in spring training Been going fine on the backfields, and I'm pitching under what my previous velocity was, but that's also like, well, I just had a brain surgery,
Right.
Not even a year ago. That would have been, I guess, only 7-8 months to that time. So team's about to break to go to Durham. I suspected I was going to do that. I had a conversation where they're like, hey, actually your velocity is not where we want it to be, so we're not going to send you out. Which I'm pissed, because I'm like, I did not come off of the head injury to go pitch in extended spring training.
Right.
Like at that point, I want to go pitch in a game, and I want it to be meaningful, right? So I stay in extended. I obviously then know, like, you got to get your velocity up. That's all that's being said to me over and over and over. Reflecting on it, I'm a hyperlax guy by nature. I'm starting to muscle up a ton. I'm doing everything I can to throw harder. I'm getting after it in the weight room. Plyos, long toss, pull downs, weighted ball pull downs, you name it. I'm throttling this thing. It's like I'm going to spike a stimulus, hit a number, and get out of here. Just gets worse and worse and worse. Ends up to the point where like I'm max efforting in bullpens like 80, 81, feeling terrible. Started losing some command. And that's when I knew, like, okay, something's going on now with the arm. Thankfully, I get out. I'm able to pitch in a game. Still feels awful. So then with the discoloration stuff, the nerve issues in my hand, have a conversation with the training staff. Obviously, it was a pretty quick TOS diagnosis. Thankfully, the medical staff did a great job. Marty Brinker, our coordinator, is awesome. Sends me to Dallas right away. Go through the whole shebang, MRI, neck, shoulder, elbow, do nerve conduction tests, get the nerve blocks put into my scalene and pec. And as soon as they did the nerve block and the scalene, my arm instantly felt better. So with TOS, your arm kind of feels like heavy, sluggish. Again, if you have nerve pain, blood flow issues, whatever it might be. But as soon as they went into the scalene, I felt it pretty much instantly. So then reflecting back, between me trying to throw with so much tension to throw harder, and I was in a neck brace for a bit in the hospital, which even after the head injury, I'm doing like, the Dr. Evil turn to look at anything.
You never regain that full cervical mobility.
Exactly. And you don't feel comfortable with it because you always want to be looking at whatever's coming your way. So we think that did a lot of scar tissue stuff with scalene, which then obviously kind of starts the compression of the brachial plexus going out, which is where I was having all that reciprocal pain. So long story short, get the TOS diagnosis, have the surgery, and thankfully that moved pretty quickly.
Yeah, I don't think people fully appreciate how much like tight scalenes impact your arm, like just neck soft tissue in general. I actually believe I've talked to Dr. Mark a little bit about. He's mentioned there's a link between concussions and like scalene tension, scalene tones. Like your body is just in this like protective state after a head injury, and like it just upregulates tone of everything. But the second your scalenes start to get tight, clamp down, just holding tension, well, your scalene's attached to your first rib. Your clavicle's right here, your brachial plexus, your everything, all your nerves, arteries run through this basically first rib clavicle interface. So if your scalenes are pulling that first rib up, you're pretty much just constricting everything. So it makes complete sense that all this scalene tone tension from the initial head injury starts to basically constrict everything in your arm. But I'm sure that at that time, like nobody was making that connection until like way after the fact.
Right. And then you also combine that with the fact that the premise of why I wasn't going out to pitch in a game is because my velocity's down. Well, what's my first thought? It's like, I'm going to muscle through this thing and give it all I've got. So then you put that additional tone on the scalenes from general tension. And like you said, too, I think the concussion linked to the scalene stuff is super prevalent, too, because as with any concussion, you also lose a little bit of eyesight tracking. So like doing saccades was a huge part of my rehab. But also, while my eyes aren't great tracking wise, then what happens? Like I'm like sitting here, like again, Dr. Evil turning everywhere. So my neck mobility's down. So these scalenes are just kind of stuck. But the scar tissue throughout there from that obviously played a huge factor in me likely needing the thoracic outlet surgery.
So for those who aren't familiar with the surgery, what exactly do they do in the surgery?
So I say it's all stemming from my scalene. Typically, it used to be you would do like a scalenectomy or first rib resection, and now they're actually doing a pec minor release as well. So just like you were speaking to in terms of where the brachial plexus runs through that triangle, now the recovery time on this surgery is the same. Whether we said, okay, it's just your scalene where an issue is, if you have scar tissue, whatever it might be, rather than just doing a scalenectomy, the procedure now is go ahead, scalenectomy, first rib resection, and the pec minor release, just because that plexus can be compressed anywhere throughout that triangle. So within that, if the recovery timeline is the exact same, it makes more sense to just go ahead and have it all done, which now that's what the surgery looks like. So thankfully, it's nothing really structural, like no joint integrity anywhere is lost. It's simply anterior middle scalene done, first rib resection, and then pec minor released. So not, people see it as like super invasive and scary, but it's really not. They're just taking out a few things.
Yeah, it depends how you view it. I mean, if you think about it, like they're going in there and they're literally like cutting out a rib, or cutting out your first rib. Like, I mean, I actually, one of my former athletes, like he had TOS surgery and he keeps his first rib like in his back pocket for good luck. Like, I mean, if you think about it from that standpoint, it is kind of aggressive to think about. Like, we're going to cut out one of your scalenes, first rib, and cut out your pec minor. It's like you just permanently change your anatomy. Or you could think about it like you're going to be back pitching and throwing in 12 weeks ish, and like nothing to be terrified of. Thousands of other people have gotten this surgery, come back to pitching.
Yeah.
So what was your mentality going into that surgery? Was it like, oh my God, they're like, I'm permanently going to be like, with a different anatomical structure?
Honestly, with how I was waking up each morning with the issues in my hand and the discoloration, like, I mean, it was to the point where I would like pick up my phone and, you know, when you like go over with your thumb to scroll or move, whatever, or swipe up, I was like, okay, well, this is painful, like every morning. So this isn't it for just my general quality of life, but B, my velocity is just plummeting. I'm like fighting to no end to try to get that back. So it's really like not a losing situation in my mind. Now, if I had some of that nerve stuff, let's say back in 2019, when I've got a full slate of clean health, then I definitely question, okay, do I need to go into surgery, or like, can I do some first rib resets throughout time, get it to calm down, scaling work, etc.? I definitely would have viewed it differently. But at that point in my career, it's like, well, I've got to do something to figure this out. And if all my symptoms align with thoracic outlet, I've got nothing to lose. Like, let me go ahead.
In your case, it was a very severe and clear-cut case.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's different types of TOS as well, right? Mm-hmm. There's, obviously you have the vasculature running through the actual like arteries and veins running through there, but you also have the nerves as well. Constricting the vasculature, that's when you'll start getting those like purple finger, hand, forearm symptoms. Constricting the nerves, that's when you start getting the numbness, the tingling, the weakness. In your case, it was both. Yeah. So obviously there was like a significant compression happening. But for somebody who has very, very mild symptoms, maybe the veto's down a little bit, maybe occasionally get a little bit of tingling. You've definitely seen different like manual resets for the first rib. Like if you're getting jammed up and you just adjust the first rib down, I've seen that happen where like the symptoms are completely gone the next day. Even myself, I've never had TOS, but I've had TOS like symptoms before from sleeping wrong, like on a pillow that's you know, too big, and you sleep, you know, in that lengthened state for the scalenes. The next morning you wake up and you're just like, it like hurts to hold your arm down, and you get that first rib readjusted, maybe some scalene tissue work, and you're completely fine the next day. So, you know, I don't want the message to be everyone that has any sort of symptoms has to go get surgery immediately. Certainly that can be the move, but it also can be if this is a mild thing that hasn't been going on for very long, like maybe try some conservative stuff first.
100%. I think, well, even now, one of my tread guys, Cole Henry, had thoracic outlet surgery, and like you looked at his case, and I think that's a great point to the thoracic outlet diagnosis, because it is still a little bit unknown. Again, that's also why I went ahead and checked every box. That's why I did the MRIs, neck, shoulder, elbow. That's why I did the nerve conduction test. That's why I do the scalene blocks. That's why go ahead and check all the boxes. Certainly by no means jump to the surgery. But a guy like Cole, for instance, like reoccurring elbow stuff here and there, like anterior shoulder stuff, all these things just kind of piled on. But he also then became in a chronic state of rehab for 2 to 3 months, pitch for a few weeks, back on the shelf. And it's like that reoccurring thing. So like you're saying, if you don't respond to kind of that short-term adjustment, if you have one day where you feel like that, certainly some adjustment with just like scalene, soft tissue, first rib reset, even a pec minor, if your pec minor is tight and compressing further out in the plexus, go ahead and work on that as well. But then, of course, if it continues on, then it's like, all right, I need to dive deeper into that.
100%. So now you've kind of worked your way back from TOS surgery. You're back to throwing around full intensity. You're getting ready to head out to spring training again. Like how do you see this season lining up for yourself? What are your goals this year? What are your just kind of general goals at this point for the rest of your career?
Yeah, so I think obviously the next box for me to check off is to pitch in the big leagues. Whether that's in Tampa or wherever, we'll see. But really, it's a clean bill of health. If we can have a full year of health, get back to, again, my identity as a pitcher, kind of like we talked about, consistency, strike throwing. A guy who before the head injury was healthy every year.
Right.
So if we could get back to that, that's great. Obviously, like even my velocity in pens without being full throttle is already harder than where I was at before the thoracic outlet, which is great. So it's really going to be continuing to push that. After you've been banged up for a few years, you appreciate just the fact of like being on the field. I think that puts things into perspective. And of course, after my head injury too, like I'm not going to take any game really for granted. But again, going back to even earlier points, like no pressure and like a performance line. It's just like go out there, have fun with it, enjoy it, compete to the best of my ability, and see how the ball rolls.
Final question would be like, what would be your advice to younger players watching this? What do you wish you'd go back in time and tell your younger self? Is there anything you'd do differently? Just thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I probably have a lot of thoughts there, honestly.
Yeah.
Going back to, I'll go back to like the college self of not getting drafted. I do think something that I wish I had then was likely somebody telling me the truth of, hey, like if we don't train you to try to get to this velocity capacity, like it's not a guarantee that you'll pitch in professional baseball. And even myself knowing the industry like I did, I still was like, at that time in 2017, if you're like 87 to 90, you're not throwing slow. Like I don't think that's classified as that, but it's like I go out and I don't know. I know I'm like top 5 in pretty much every record category at George Mason at a mid-major D1, and like I still don't get a chance to pitch professionally. Like that just doesn't line up from what you're being told from a young age. But looking back, I wish I had somebody in my corner kind of telling me like, hey, we know you're performing and you're doing what you can now, but these things are also really, really important in addition. So growing velocity capacity at a young age, I think that would have been huge for me to remember that that's what professional teams are looking at long term. I would say now in my position is simply to enjoy where you're at. Again, like 2019, great year. I'm on top of the world. I think I'm going to be in the big leagues very quickly. I actually feel really confident in that. Obviously 2021 happens, and then I'm just thankful to be alive and enjoy daily functionality in life and do what I love. So from that standpoint, that completely reframes me. It's like my mind's not like I have to be a big leaguer to improve my life satisfaction. It's now like I need to actually be in each moment, each day, and enjoy these things, because it doesn't last forever. Never know when it's going to be taken away. So that certainly reframed my priorities of what to really enjoy in the moment. I used to be like, if I missed one training day, like life's over. Like if I didn't do exactly what I wanted, I'd be losing my mind all day. But now I've relaxed a little bit, try to enjoy each day. Of course, still be disciplined, do what you can to get to your goal. But it's not make or break each given day.
Right. A little bit more perspective, a little bit more forgiveness for yourself. I love that. But Z, appreciate you being on. We'll definitely touch on some more data-related topics in the next one of these. But I wanted to kind of give people some insight into your own story, because we haven't touched on it too much in a public-facing fashion. But it's a pretty cool story, and we're all rooting for you this year. So good luck with everything.
Yeah, thanks. How about that?